In the dead of night, surrounded by danger, a broken radio crackled to life with a calm, unknown voice. It gave secret directions that saved lives, but who was speaking? This is the untold story of a mysterious signal that changed everything. The trees of the Hürtgen Forest stood tall and still, their bare limbs stretching into a pale, cloud-heavy sky. Rain had fallen earlier, soaking the ground into a thick mess of mud and broken leaves. A soft mist curled low around the roots, drifting like it was trying to hide something. The air was quiet now, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, the kind that made even the sound of a breath feel too loud. Lieutenant Marcus Elwood crouched behind a fallen tree, gripping his coat tighter around his chest. He was young, just a few months past 24, with a fresh stripe on his shoulder and a weight on his face that didn't match his age. He had been promoted not long ago after his former commanding officer was taken out during a surprise attack near Aachen. Now he led what remained of a small unit, less than a dozen men, tired and worn, deep in the woods near the Hürtgen line. They weren't supposed to be this far in. That morning, they'd been ordered to scout along a wooded path, just north of a village that had already been cleared. But something had gone wrong. A sudden push from the other side cut them off. By mid-afternoon, the route back was gone. Roads blocked, paths behind them swept by patrols. Now it was nearly dark, and they were stranded. Sergeant Joe Renner sat nearby, squatting with his hands wrapped around a warm can of coffee he hadn't touched. He had seen more winters in Europe than he cared to count, his face carved with quiet lines of age and caution. Where Elwood's gaze flicked from tree to tree, searching, nervous, Renner watched the forest like he was listening for a language only he could understand. "Radio's still out," Private Nolan Briggs muttered, tapping the box of wires and metal resting on his lap. His fingers were blackened from soot and grease, his face young but focused. "I think the antenna's cracked. I can get it to power, but no signal gets through. It's just static." Elwood nodded but didn't answer. What could he say? There were no maps for this part of the forest, at least none they could trust. The roads they'd taken in had changed. The sounds they heard in the distance, vehicles, sometimes voices, never gave them enough to tell which way was safe. "We need to move before dark," Renner said softly. "Can't stay here." "Move where?" Elwood whispered, looking up. "There's no way out, not unless we go back through the low ridge." "There's mines down there," Renner replied, "and more waiting past the ridge." Briggs turned a dial, trying again. The radio box hissed softly. Static washed through it in waves. And then it stopped. For a few seconds the box went dead silent. No buzz, no hum. Then, a voice. Calm, even, it spoke slowly, clearly, with a gentle firmness that made all three men freeze where they were. "You need to head northwest, down the dry creek bed. Stay low. Do not take the ridge path. There are marked hazards along the trail." Briggs jerked his head up. "Sir, that wasn't me. That wasn't our frequency." Elwood leaned in close. "Say again, who is this?" No answer. The voice didn't return, but for a moment everything had changed. The static returned with a soft crackle, like rain on a roof. Renner narrowed his eyes. "Did you recognize that voice?" "No," Elwood said quietly, "and there was no name, no origin." Briggs flipped the switch again, scrolling across channels, nothing but noise. But there it was, the creek bed. They had passed it hours ago, shallow and dry, twisting through the trees in the opposite direction of the ridge. They had ignored it earlier because it didn't seem to lead anywhere. "Could be a trap," Renner said. "Or a trick. We've heard of that before." "But how would they know our location?" Elwood asked. "How would they know about the ridge path?" Briggs, still tuning, looked up with a strange expression. "Sir, I didn't say anything about the ridge. The voice told us first." The weight of that realization settled in with the fog. Elwood glanced at the trees, then at his men. His hands were cold, not from the weather, but something else, something deeper. "All right," he said at last. "We move. We take the creek bed." He looked at Briggs. "Keep that radio on." And with that they gathered their gear, quiet, focused, moving single file into the forest toward a dry creek that none of them had trusted until the voice had spoken. None of them knew who it was, but somehow, it had just saved their lives. And none of them knew it wouldn't be the last time. The forest grew darker as Lieutenant Marcus Elwood's unit moved into the shallow trench of the dry creek bed. The mist thickened, curling around their legs like it was trying to hold them in place. There was no sound but the soft crunch of boots on wet leaves, and the occasional distant thump from far-off explosions, steady, muffled, like a heartbeat they couldn't ignore. Elwood led with careful steps, eyes scanning every bend. Behind him came Sergeant Joe Renner, eyes sharp as ever, followed by Private Nolan Briggs, carrying the damaged radio slung over his shoulder. The rest of the unit trailed behind, exhausted, cold, but among them was Corporal Luis Medina, limping slightly from a twisted ankle, still managing to carry his pack without complaint. The voice on the radio hadn't returned since that first message, but it echoed in Elwood's mind. "You need to head northwest, down the dry creek bed. Stay low. Do not take the ridge path. There are marked hazards along the trail." He remembered the calmness in it, not rushed, not afraid, just clear, like someone who knew the forest better than any of them. As they pushed forward, the fog thickened, visibility dropped, the trees blurred into gray pillars, stretching upward into nothing. That's when the first whistle rang through the air, sharp and right. "Down," Renner shouted. They dropped instantly, hugging the wet ground. The shell hit somewhere behind them, far enough not to do harm, but close enough to feel. The ground shook softly, dirt sliding down the sides of the dry creek. Briggs flinched, tightening his grip on the radio. "They're zeroing in. Keep moving," Elwood said quietly, single file, eyes on the trees. They pushed forward, climbing over branches, stepping over shallow roots. The creek bed twisted through a narrow part of the woods now, where the trees grew thicker and the light barely reached the ground. Then the radio crackled again, just for a second. Briggs froze. "Sir," the voice returned, calm, even. "Split to the right at the fork. 20 paces, there's a wire across the trail. Do not touch the logs." It cut off again, just as quickly. Elwood blinked. "What fork?" They pushed on, and within 2 minutes the creek forked left and right. One side climbed gently, the other dipped into a narrow trench. Both looked the same, muddy, broken, shadowed by trees. Elwood didn't hesitate. "Right side, watch for logs." He didn't question it, not anymore. Just a few steps into the right path, Renner spotted it. There. A thick pile of branches stacked near the ground, strangely neat, wires glinting beneath them, barely visible in the low light. "Booby trap," Renner muttered. They marked the spot quietly and moved on. Behind them they heard a distant noise, metal scraping, then a sudden sharp blast. Somewhere nearby something had gone wrong for someone else. Briggs looked back, his face pale. "Other patrols?" Elwood nodded slowly. "That could have been us." They didn't talk much after that. The trail dipped again, and they moved deeper into the forest. Rain had started again, light but enough to make the mud slippery. A small clearing opened ahead, with an old wooden structure near the edge. It looked like a tool shed or maybe a communications hut from before the battle line had shifted. Renner lifted his hand. "Wait, something's wrong." Briggs opened the radio to listen again, but all they heard was quiet static. Suddenly the voice returned. "Do not enter the structure. There's a tripwire just inside the frame. Turn around the north tree line, keep distance." The radio fell silent again. Medina, who had moved ahead to check the building, stopped just in time. He turned, breathing hard. "I didn't see anything," he said, but backed up quickly. Renner and Elwood stepped closer, scanning the entrance. The door was crooked on its hinges, barely hanging. As Elwood studied it, his eyes caught something glinting across the floor, thin wire, nearly invisible. He turned to Briggs. "Get Medina out of here, now." They circled the clearing instead, sticking to the tree line, moving faster now. Briggs stayed close to Medina, helping him balance as his limp worsened. The corporal had been trying to hide it, but the pain was clear now. Renner gave him a nod of respect. "You'd be a memory now if you'd walked in." Medina gave a small, tired smile. "I didn't even think to check." That voice, how'd it know? No one answered. As they made their way past the clearing, they heard another sound, one they'd been trying to avoid. Voices in the distance, not English. Elwood signaled quietly and the unit dropped low again. A group of enemy soldiers was sweeping the woods just a few hundred yards away. Their path would have intersected directly with the ridge trail, the one the voice had warned them away from earlier. Renner whispered, "If we'd gone that way." Briggs just shook his head. "We wouldn't be having this conversation." The patrol passed without seeing them. Elwood held the group in silence for several long minutes before waving them forward again. They moved carefully, every sense on edge. The terrain grew steeper, the mud deeper. Once Briggs nearly slipped, but Medina caught his arm, steadying him. Despite his limp, he hadn't slowed. No one mentioned it. They all just moved. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, they reached the edge of the forest. A road lay ahead, a gravel path winding westward toward friendly lines. Elwood didn't trust it at first. He crouched, scanning the tree line, watching the shadows. Then the radio clicked again. "You are near safe ground. Proceed west. Avoid the clearing to your left. Use the ditch beside the road." It was the last time they heard the voice that day. Following the instructions exactly, they stayed low and moved through the ditch. After about an hour, they spotted the edge of a checkpoint. Uniforms they recognized. Relief. Help. They were safe. Later that evening, when the rest of the division regrouped, Elwood learned that 3 nearby squads had taken the ridge path. They hadn't returned. Some had been caught in an ambush near the tool hut. The rest likely never made it out of the mines. No one knew who gave the warning. Elwood reported the strange radio message to command, but nothing came of it. The frequency wasn't listed. No unit had reported sending the call, and when they ran a trace on the signal, it led nowhere. Still, Elwood remembered the voice, every word, calm, steady, strange, like someone watching from the trees, unseen. They called it luck. Elwood didn't. He called it something else. And as the days passed, deep in the heart of the Hürtgen Forest, that voice would return again. Snow fell like ash over the frozen woods of Belgium. It was December 1944, and the world had changed again. After the horrors of the Hürtgen Forest, Lieutenant Marcus Elwood's unit had been absorbed into a larger Allied force moving toward the front near Bastogne. They were tired, worn down by months of combat, and now facing one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in years. It was supposed to be a routine repositioning maneuver, support the flanks, reinforce thin lines, keep pressure where the enemy was weak. But nothing was routine anymore. The Germans had launched a surprise offensive, cutting deep through the Ardennes. The snowstorm had swallowed roads and landmarks. Maps were worthless. Visibility was barely more than a few feet, and the radio lines, what was left of them, crackled with broken transmissions or went silent altogether. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Elwood stood near a frozen hedgerow, staring at a map that might as well have been written in a foreign language. His gloves were stiff with ice. His breath fogged in front of him like smoke. Around him, soldiers moved slowly, bundled in coats that couldn't keep out the cold. Sergeant Joe Renner walked over, stamping his boots into the snow. "We're supposed to move out in 20 minutes, Renner said, "but no one knows where." Elwood folded the map and looked toward the woods. "Have you seen Briggs?" "Back with the tanks," Renner said. "Trying to pull something out of that radio. He's been at it for an hour." The tanks, 5 of them, were supposed to form a mobile column to punch through the edge of Bastogne, but visibility was zero. The route forward was unconfirmed, and recent artillery hits had left the fields ahead dangerously exposed. Private Nolan Briggs sat hunched in the back of a half-track, fiddling with wires and knobs. The radio was only half working now, and even that was generous. Static hissed through the speaker like wind through broken glass. Elwood climbed into the vehicle beside him. "Anything?" Briggs shook his head. "Snow's messing everything up. We're blind." Renner leaned in. "We can't move tanks through this without eyes. If we send them blind, they'll walk right into artillery." Just then the static shifted. It was faint, almost drowned by the white noise, but it was there. "Column must turn left at the fort bridge out ahead. Heavy artillery covering southern slope." The voice. The same calm tone. The same unhurried rhythm. Clear instructions. No identification. No call sign. Briggs turned the dial gently. "It's him again," he said quietly. Elwood listened. The message repeated. Same instructions, a different path, a left turn that wasn't marked on their maps, an alternate slope hidden by the trees, and one quiet warning. "First tank must not stop at the crest. If it pauses, they will be spotted." Then, silence. Word spread fast. The voice, the same one that had guided them through the forest, was back. No one questioned how, they just listened. Elwood relayed the instructions to the tank commander, Captain Reeves, a firm but skeptical man who didn't like acting on unconfirmed intel. He stood in the snow beside his lead tank, arms crossed. "Who gave you this?" he asked Elwood. No one I can confirm, Elwood admitted, but last time it kept us alive. Reeves frowned. We move based on command, not ghosts. You move based on survival, Renner muttered behind him. Reeves turned without answering and climbed into his tank. Elwood and Briggs shared a look. The column moved out slowly, 4 tanks following the voice's suggested path, one taking the original route toward the southern slope. Minutes passed. The snowfall thickened. Briggs kept the radio tuned, hoping for another message, but the signal had vanished again. Then, in the distance, a dull sound followed by a flash behind the trees. There wasn't lightning. They waited. 1 tank didn't return. A messenger on foot arrived an hour later, face pale and eyes wide. He spoke in quiet tones, near the rear truck. The lead tank took the slope. They got locked in at the crest, direct hit from enemy guns across the ridge. Rees's tank was gone. The others, those that followed the voice, arrived at the rendezvous point without incident. They had skirted the edge of a frozen ravine and passed through a grove the maps didn't even show. No enemy fire, no ambush, just silence and snow. That night the soldiers huddled inside an abandoned farmhouse, the walls groaning from wind outside. A fire crackled in a barrel near the door, and the men stood around it for warmth. Renner leaned against the windowsill, watching the whiteout continue. They're starting to talk. Elwood looked up. About what? Renner smiled faintly. The voice. Briggs says it's the same tone, same pattern, doesn't match any known operator. Command has no record of someone giving out orders on that frequency. Elwood sighed. We're not supposed to believe in stories. Tell that to the tank crew that made it back. In the corner, Briggs sat quietly with the radio, as if willing it to speak again. He didn't seem shaken, just focused. Corporal Medina limped in from the back room, where he'd been checking on a few injured soldiers. His leg hadn't fully recovered since the forest, but he didn't complain. He never did. He looked at the others, then nodded toward the radio. Any word? Nothing yet, Briggs replied, but it always comes when it counts. A younger private near the door lowered his voice. They're calling it the Phantom on the line. Some of the new guys say it's a ghost, one that only shows up to save lives. Elwood didn't answer. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he had heard that voice twice now, once in the middle of a foggy forest, and again in a blizzard during the dead of winter. Each time it had told them where not to go. Each time, it had been right. The next day, they moved out again. This time, there were no clear instructions, no signal. The radio stayed silent. They passed fields filled with frozen craters and half-buried vehicles. Tracks in the snow vanished into ditches. Here and there they found signs of other units, gear left behind, markings in the snow, footprints heading in wrong directions. As they climbed a wooded ridge near a frozen stream, Briggs paused. He tapped the radio once, then twice. A faint click answered him. Then the voice again. Hold position. Units ahead have drawn artillery attention. Wait for 5 minutes, then move northwest through the ravine. Stay close to the right side. It ended again, as quickly as it had started. They waited. Exactly 5 minutes later, a loud echo rolled through the trees, the sound of another round hitting the far ridge. Elwood gave the signal. They moved. That evening, they regrouped in a makeshift shelter built into a collapsed barn. Word had already traveled. Another group had tried to push through the woods without guidance. They hadn't returned. Renner sat by the fire with Medina and Briggs, passing around a metal cup of hot broth. I don't need to understand it, Renner said. I just want to know why. Briggs stared into the flames. Maybe it's someone out there, some scout or operator, someone who's just listening all the time. Or maybe, Medina said softly, it's someone who didn't leave, someone who never got out of that forest. The wind rattled the broken boards in the roof. Snow crept in through the gaps. Elwood sat nearby, listening in silence. He had led his men through some of the darkest parts of this war. He had seen things that would stay with him forever, but nothing unsettled him like the voice on the radio. Calm, invisible, always just ahead of the danger. And the most unsettling part? No one ever answered when they called back. The snow had barely melted by the time the questions began. After the events in the Ardennes, Lieutenant Marcus Elwood's unit was pulled from the front lines and stationed at a temporary Allied command post west of Bastogne. On the surface it looked like a routine debrief, a standard check-in after days of chaos and confusion on the battlefield. but the tone in the command room was far from casual. Elwood stood in a dimly lit tent, its canvas walls shivering from the wind outside. A row of senior officers sat behind a narrow table, faces serious, voices measured. Files were stacked beside them: after-action reports, radio logs, written testimonies from the tank crews. And all of it circled back to one point. The voice on the radio. "We've reviewed your movements," one colonel said, tapping his fingers against the table. "And we have a problem, Lieutenant. You made a series of route changes without official orders." Elwood kept his tone steady. "Those changes kept our men out of direct fire. We avoided ambushes, lost fewer vehicles than we expected. We followed instructions that—" "What instructions?" the colonel cut in. "There is no record of any radio operator from our side transmitting to your unit during those hours. None." Beside him, a signals officer opened a report. "We checked the frequencies. We checked the time logs. Even considered the possibility of a long-range field unit sending emergency orders. But the bandwidth was all wrong. We would have picked it up. Nothing was sent through official channels." Another officer leaned forward. "Are you suggesting a civilian hijacked military signals, or are you telling us you followed a voice you couldn't identify?" Elwood hesitated. He knew how it sounded. He'd questioned it himself 100 times. But the voice had been real. It had saved them. That wasn't theory, it was fact. "We received instructions from a clear source," he said firmly. "Whoever it was knew where we were and where the enemy had positioned artillery. They gave us escape paths. They warned us of mines. They told us when to hold position. And every time we listened, we survived." "And when you didn't?" the colonel asked. Elwood glanced at the floor. One tank didn't follow the signal. It was hit. The others made it through. The room fell silent. Then the signals officer spoke again. "There are rumors," he said carefully, "spreading through the ranks, soldiers saying the voice has no name, no location, no trace. Some are calling it something else." Elwood looked up. "What are you calling it?" The officer didn't answer. Back in the barracks, the mood was tense. Word of the investigation had reached the men. Some felt exposed. Others felt like they were being blamed for surviving. Sergeant Renner sat on a crate near the stove, warming his hands. Private Nolan Briggs was beside him, carefully cleaning the radio equipment again, though it didn't need cleaning. It was his way of thinking. "I heard one of the brass call it a prank," Renner said, "like someone's messing with us from the inside." Briggs shook his head. "No way. Whoever it was, he knew things. No prankster could time it like that. No one plays jokes with lives on the line." Corporal Medina, still limping from the forest, joined them. "Or maybe it's not someone," he said softly. "Maybe it's something." Renner looked up. "You starting to believe the ghost stories?" Medina didn't smile. "It saved us. That voice knew about a trap under the bunker. I was standing 2 feet from it. If I had gone in first." The words hung there. Elwood returned to his quarters later that evening, only to find a sealed envelope on his cot. He opened it and read the simple typed message inside. "You are not to act on any unverified transmissions going forward. Orders must come from confirmed Allied channels only." There was no signature, just the seal of the command office. Elwood sat down slowly, hands tightening around the letter. They wanted him to ignore the voice. The same voice that had led them through one of the worst stretches of the war. The same voice that had warned them before every danger. He understood the reasoning, trusting something, or someone, you couldn't see, couldn't verify, went against every rule of warfare. But war hadn't followed the rules for a long time. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Was it really a rogue operator, some Allied scout cut off from command but still trying to guide survivors? Or had they stumbled onto something stranger, something no one could explain? Later that night, Elwood joined Renner and Briggs, outside the barracks. The snowfall had returned, and the sky above was awash of pale clouds. Briggs had the radio with him, the antenna extended and turned toward the horizon. He was still listening. Elwood watched him for a while, then said, "I got official orders today." Briggs looked up. "They want you to stop listening." Elwood nodded. "They think it's a trick, or a ghost story, or something worse." Renner chuckled quietly. "You know, it's funny, I'd rather follow a ghost who saves lives than a desk officer who's never stepped in a trench." Elwood didn't answer. He looked at the snow, then at the trees in the distance. Somewhere beyond those woods were lines of men waiting for orders that might never come. Somewhere out there was someone alive, or not, watching over them. "We'll do what we have to," Elwood finally said. "But if that voice calls again, I won't ignore it." Briggs nodded. "Neither will I." As the wind picked up and the camp settled into silence, the three of them stood there, listening. The radio hissed softly. No words came through that night. But they knew it would return when they needed it most. March 1945. The war was nearing its brutal conclusion, but the fight was far from over. The Allies had reached the Rhine River, a natural barrier, long seen as Germany's last major line of defense. Towns on both sides had already crumbled under shelling, and word spread fast. The Germans were destroying every bridge as they pulled back, but then came Remagen. A single bridge still stood, the Ludendorff Bridge. It was battered and partially damaged but intact, and the race to capture it had begun. Lieutenant Marcus Elwood and his unit were part of the second wave of infantry approaching the town. The first wave had encountered scattered resistance and had taken the ridge overlooking the bridge by dawn. Elwood's group had orders to move in behind armored support and secure a path for engineers. "Look at that thing," Sergeant Renner said, pointing at the long steel structure stretching across the Rhine. "Looks like it's holding itself up with willpower alone." Elwood said nothing. He had seen the reports. The Germans had wired the bridge with explosives. No one knew how much time they had. Private Nolan Briggs adjusted the straps on the radio pack. "I'll try to get something on the line. We've got static again, but the reception's not completely gone." They pressed forward through the remains of the train yard. Thick smoke hung in the air. Charred metal was scattered across the tracks. The roar of distant artillery echoed from the far bank. The bridge was a tangle of confusion, engineers, infantry, medics, and scattered reports coming in every few minutes. Some said explosives had been found. Others said the charges had already been triggered and failed. The tension was high enough to snap steel. Briggs frowned as he turned a dial on the unit strapped to his back. "Sir, I've got something." Elwood stopped in his tracks. "Is it command?" Briggs shook his head slowly. "It's him." Renner glanced over. "You sure?" Briggs nodded. "Same tone, same rhythm. Calm, clear. He says to check the old rail car on the south platform. Says it's not what it looks like." Elwood turned toward the platform. An old flatbed rail car sat there, rusted and empty, except for a few canvas covers draped across its frame. "Let's go," he said. They moved fast but careful. The platform was narrow, the stone steps leading down still covered in debris from earlier shelling. A few Allied soldiers looked over curiously, but no one stopped them. The rail car didn't seem important, just another relic in a battlefield littered with them. But as they reached it, Renner paused. "Smell that?" he asked. Elwood nodded. Something acrid lingered in the air. Oil, maybe, or chemicals. Briggs stayed back while Elwood and Renner approached the car. They peeled back the canvas cautiously. Underneath was what looked like an ordinary crate. But tucked beneath it, half hidden, was a tangled cluster of wires leading down through the floor. Renner's expression darkened. He wasn't guessing. Elwood waved down an engineer squad that had just arrived from the bridge. Within minutes, the area was roped off, and a bomb technician was carefully dismantling the setup. They found 3 primed charges, hidden under a false crate. If triggered, they would have sent the entire southern side of the bridge platform crashing into the water below, taking anyone nearby with it. At the same time, a separate squad positioned further downriver had ignored a similar warning that crackled briefly through Briggs' radio. The voice had advised avoiding the tunnel access near the collapsed rail line, but the squad's leader pressed for time and under orders had brushed off the alert, believing it to be misinformation or interference. The tunnel detonated as they moved in. The blast sent debris flying skyward. Dust and fire tore through the surrounding brush. In the confusion, the loss was swift and disorienting. When word reached Elwood's unit, no one said a word. They simply stared at the radio in Briggs' hands. By nightfall, the Ludendorff Bridge had been secured. Despite the damage it held, the engineers worked non-stop to reinforce it, and hundreds of soldiers crossed the Rhine under the cover of darkness. The operation was declared a major success. High Command called it a turning point. The capture of the bridge gave the Allies a direct route into Germany's heartland, and shocked German leadership. They had never expected the Americans to cross the river so quickly. But for Elwood's unit, the success felt less like victory and more like survival. They had followed a voice again, one without a name, without a face, with no credentials or recognition, and once again it had guided them through the worst of it. Back at the temporary camp set up near the riverbank, Elwood sat with Renner, Briggs, and Corporal Medina. The sounds of distant construction could still be heard from the bridge. Trucks rolled past, headlights off, moving toward the new front. Briggs stared at the radio, still powered on, silent now. No one stepped forward, he said quietly. Not a signal officer, not a scout, no one. Elwood nodded. They asked me to submit another report. What'd you write? Medina asked. I told them the truth, Elwood replied. Again, that someone warned us, that someone saved us, that someone who's not in their files knew more than anyone in our command tower. Renner took a deep breath. They'll bury it. Elwood didn't disagree. But we'll remember it, he said. There was silence between them, a respectful one, almost reverent. Then Briggs spoke. He said something else just before the call dropped off. Elwood looked over. What? Briggs hesitated, then recited the words exactly. This bridge leads to more than just the other side. Don't stop walking once you cross it. They let that hang in the air. None of them knew what it meant, but they had learned by now not to dismiss the voice. Its words carried weight, even if the meaning wasn't clear right away. As the firelight flickered across their faces, the four men sat quietly. The bridge had held. The war pressed on. The mystery deepened. And still, no name, no signal tag, no explanation. Just a voice, guiding them through the storm. Eastern Germany, early April 1945, the war was closing in from all sides. Allied forces pushed from the west, while Soviet troops advanced swiftly from the east. Villages emptied, roads clogged with retreating forces, and tension thickened with every mile gained. As the line shifted, chaos followed. Lieutenant Marcus Elwood's unit had been ordered to sweep through abandoned rail lines and scattered outposts near the edge of the forested region east of Dresden. They had seen fewer signs of resistance in the past few days, but something about the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt more like something was being hidden. Private Nolan Briggs walked closely behind Elwood, carefully guarding the now weathered radio unit that had become a lifeline more than once. Sergeant Renner led the group, scanning the tree lines. They hadn't heard the mysterious voice in weeks. Not since the bridge at Remagen, but the memory lingered in all of them, especially in Elwood. The man who'd once questioned every instinct now found himself quietly hoping the voice might return, even as others remained skeptical. That afternoon, as the group moved through a grove of thin birch trees, Briggs suddenly stopped. Sir, he said, eyes wide, it's him. The static had cleared, just for a second. Then came the familiar calm tone. Follow the utility trail behind the old signal station. Do not use the main road. Convoy arriving at dusk. You must stop them before the tunnel. The voice faded just as quickly. Briggs looked up. That's all he said. Elwood gave a short nod. There were no coordinates, no names, no units mentioned. Just a warning and a direction. They changed course immediately, turning off the paved track and moving through a narrow path half swallowed by overgrowth. Soon they reached the signal station, long abandoned and covered in vines. The trail behind it led down toward a valley. Then they saw it, low buildings surrounded by fences, a prison camp. Renner raised his binoculars. That's not one of ours. Barbed wire lined the perimeter. Guard towers stood at each corner, and inside, small clusters of thin figures moved between the sheds. Prisoners. Elwood's chest tightened. We're too far out for regular rescue operations. Briggs, scanning a captured map, pointed toward a set of tracks leading away from the camp. There's a tunnel through the mountain ridge, the only way out from here. As they watched, a transport convoy began to form near the gates. Covered trucks, armed guards, prisoners lined up in small groups. They're moving them, Renner said grimly. Elwood could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a standard relocation, it was something else, something final. He gave the order, intercept before the tunnel. They moved fast, staying in the trees above the road. Time slipped away too quickly. As the sun dipped behind the hills, shadows stretched across the dirt road. Then, the distant rumble of engines. 3 trucks appeared, moving slowly along the gravel path. Prisoners sat inside, weak, silent, eyes hollow. Behind the trucks, 2 scout vehicles followed. Elwood and his team moved into position. They had one chance to stop them before the convoy entered the mountain tunnel. Elwood raised his hand. On my signal. Briggs crouched low, clutching the radio, whispering as if the voice could still hear him. Please let this be right. Then came the call. The team swept down onto the road with precision. The scene erupted into chaos, shouting, scattering guards, the convoy screeching to a halt. A short but intense firefight followed, echoing through the hills. Renner covered the rear while Elwood and 2 others sprinted for the trucks. Moments later, it was over. The prisoners, over 50 in total, stumbled out of the trucks. Some collapsed onto the ground. A few sobbed openly. Others clung to one another as if unsure whether what was happening was real. One elderly prisoner, his face gaunt but his eyes clear, grabbed Elwood's arm. "You came, we thought we'd been forgotten." Another whispered, "They said they'd move us." No one believed them. "We thought it was the end." Night fell as reinforcements arrived. The camp was cleared. The remaining guards surrendered without resistance. Inside the main office, Elwood found documents confirming it all. An order to evacuate the camp before Soviet arrival, with instructions to leave no witnesses. The planned route, straight through the mountain tunnel. Elwood stood quietly staring at the paper in his hand. "He saved them," Briggs said softly beside him. He knew. They never found any trace of the operator. No signal logs, no source, no name. Only that brief, clear message over the crackling radio, and a decision that made all the difference. The rescued prisoners were taken to safety. Many of them would spend weeks recovering in hospitals, barely strong enough to speak, but over time stories began to circulate about how, just before the trucks arrived, some of them had felt something like a hush in the air, like a moment being paused. Some believed it had been a sign, a miracle, a voice they couldn't hear, guiding strangers to their rescue. Elwood never corrected them. As he watched the camp disappear in the rearview mirror, he simply looked out at the winding road ahead. The war still had its final chapters to write, but for dozens of lives that evening, the silence had been broken, just in time, by a voice they still couldn't explain. May 1945. The war in Europe was nearly over, but the battles hadn't all ended. Some of the hardest days still lay ahead. Allied forces had begun the final push into Czechoslovakia. The city of Prague, still under German control, was the last major European capital not yet liberated. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, and civilians were trapped behind walls guarded by retreating enemy forces who had nothing to lose. The mission for Lieutenant Marcus Elwood and his unit was urgent. A secret Allied directive had assigned them to work with local Czech partisans to reach a detainment site outside Prague before Soviet forces arrived. Time was critical. Reports suggested that high-value political prisoners were being moved or eliminated to prevent their rescue. Elwood's team, what remained of it, was lean but focused. Sergeant Joe Renner walked ahead, eyes sharp beneath his helmet, while Private Nolan Briggs carried the dented radio unit with care, like it was something sacred. The memory of the POW rescue still lingered, though none of them talked about it much. They all knew they had been guided by more than luck that night. Now the weight of this final mission pressed heavy on all of them. They were joined by a group of Czech partisans near the Bohemian Forest, a dozen locals who knew the land and had supposedly helped guide Allied teams through dangerous routes. Their leader, a man called Milan, spoke fluent English and carried himself like someone used to authority. "This road," he told Elwood, pointing to a winding dirt path cutting through the woods, "is safest. Germans moved their posts west to defend the city. This way is clean." Elwood studied him for a moment. Something about Milan's certainty didn't sit right, but orders were orders, and the official intel matched what he was saying. Still, as they began their advance deeper into the thick woods, an uneasy silence settled over the group. By twilight, the forest closed in. The path narrowed, twisting between dense trees. Fog drifted low along the ground, and the only sounds were boots on dirt and the occasional distant owl. Briggs held the radio close, adjusting the knobs slowly, more out of habit than hope. The thing had barely worked since Dresden, and static was now its usual companion. Then, faintly, a signal broke through. "Stop. Move left off the trail. 10 paces. You are walking into a trap." Briggs froze. "It's him." Elwood turned instantly. "Repeat it." The voice came again, calm, exact, without panic. "You are being led to a German machine post. Coordinates suggest 3 gunners with sight lines through clearing. Move left now and prepare for flank position." "Joe," Elwood shouted quietly to Renner, "take left cover, now." The unit broke off the trail, pushing into thicker brush. Milan and his men started yelling, confused, trying to wave them back. But Elwood raised his weapon. Not another step forward, he warned. Get down. That's when the first shot cracked the air, high and sharp, from the direction ahead on the trail. It missed narrowly, but it confirmed everything. Milan's eyes narrowed. He muttered something to his men, but too late. Renner had already swept behind them with 2 others. In moments, the false partisans were surrounded. The ambush had been real, and Milan's team hadn't been helpers. They were feeding information to enemy holdouts still hiding in the forest, desperate forces clinging to control with nothing left to lose. Night settled over the woods as Elwood's unit cleared the threat. Milan and his group were disarmed and restrained. Further questioning revealed the full truth. Enemy officers had promised them safety in exchange for directing Allied patrols into kill zones. Some partisans had accepted, choosing survival over loyalty. Elwood didn't speak much after that. Instead, he turned to the radio again. "Are you still there?" he asked. Silence. Briggs adjusted the frequency, but there was nothing more. The voice so clear moments earlier had vanished once again. Renner patted Elwood's shoulder. "He did it again. Saved us." Elwood nodded, then turned his focus forward. They still had a mission. Guided now only by compass and instinct, the team navigated the last stretch of forest. The road to the detainment site was believed to be under guard, but thanks to the voice's warning, they had gained an unexpected advantage. As midnight approached, they reached the ridge above the holding compound. Below, in the shadow of the trees, stood a large gated building. Faint lights flickered from inside. Elwood looked through binoculars. "They're still there, no movement to evacuate yet." He opened the field map. "If we follow the ridge line south, then swing in from the east, we can flank the rear." "Just like the voice said," Briggs whispered. They moved silently, through thick brush, around the outer fence, past watch posts, timing every step. When they reached the back gate, Renner signaled, "Go." They stormed in fast, coordinated. By the time the enemy realized they weren't partisans or guards, it was too late. Doors were breached, cells opened. Inside they found over 30 political prisoners, journalists, professors, and former government officials. Some were weak, others barely standing, but all alive. One man clutched Elwood's hand, with trembling fingers. We thought no one was coming," he whispered in Czech-accented English. "We heard the trucks yesterday, thought we would be moved soon, somewhere final." They helped the prisoners out, guiding them gently through the woods to safety. By morning, Allied command confirmed the operation as one of the last successful rescues before Prague's official liberation. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. Later that day, as the unit rested in a makeshift base just west of the city, Elwood sat beside Briggs, with the radio on his lap. They listened to the static one final time. "Do you think he'll speak again?" Briggs asked softly. Elwood watched the cloudy sky outside the tent. "I don't know, maybe his job is done." Renner stepped in, wiping his hands with a towel. "No trace of him, huh?" "None," Briggs replied. "No source. No signal log. Just a voice, whenever we needed it most." Silence lingered between them. Then Elwood said quietly, "Whoever he is, or was, he saved more lives than we'll ever be able to count." They sat a while longer, and though the radio never spoke again, they all understood something deeper. Some wars are fought with weapons. Others are won with voices that never show their face, but change the course of history all the same. Washington, D.C. The war was long over, but its shadow still followed Marcus Elwood like a quiet companion. The medals in the drawer, the faded maps, and the worn photo of his unit were reminders of things most others had chosen to forget. He hadn't worn a uniform in years. Now he wore a tie, worked behind a desk, and helped other veterans navigate pensions, treatments, and memories. The Veterans Affairs office smelled of ink and coffee. The days passed in paper trails and slow conversations. Most of the younger men who came in had moved on. Elwood hadn't. Not fully. But Teddy still thought about the voice, not every day, but more than he admitted. Sometimes in the silence of the office at dusk, he'd catch himself staring at the old radio set he'd taken with him when the war ended. It hadn't worked in years, but he kept it anyway, like a monument to a question no one else seemed to ask. Then, one Thursday afternoon, something strange happened. A man named Russell Ames walked in. A tall, thin fellow with glasses too large for his face, and a stack of folders tucked under one arm. He was a former communications officer, now working at the National Archives as part of a military signals audit team. He'd come in for assistance with a records discrepancy related to veterans' benefits. As they went over the forms, Ames paused and glanced at the framed unit photo on Elwood's desk. "That's you at Remagen?" he asked. Elwood nodded. "That's right, you know it." Ames chuckled. "We studied that operation in signal school. Whole thing's considered a communications nightmare, except for one weird success story." He said it casually, like it meant nothing. But to Elwood, it was everything. "What weird success story?" Elwood asked, eyes narrowing. Ames shrugged. "There were these old radio logs that showed a field unit. Yours, I think, received guidance from a non-registered transmission. Nobody on record was giving commands at that time. It got flagged as anomalous, probably just interference, but I remember thinking it was odd. One of the techs said the source had come from a tower that had already been destroyed weeks before."
Elwood didn't blink. "You still have those records?"
Ames frowned. "They're buried somewhere. Most of it's declassified now, but the logs are in bad shape. Lots of redactions. Static on paper, if you ask me." Elwood leaned back, pulse rising. He hadn't told anyone in years. Not since the Prague operation. Not since the voice vanished for good. "Can you get me access?" he asked quietly. 2 weeks later, Elwood stood in the basement of the National Archives, in a cold records room that smelled like dust and old wires. Ames handed him a worn box labeled "Yes, Transmissions, Western European Theater, 1944. "It's all in here," Ames said, "but I can't promise it'll make sense." Elwood sat down at a long metal table and began turning pages. The first few entries were typical call signs, timestamps, scribbled notations. But soon things shifted. He found a log dated December 19, 1944, the height of the Ardennes whiteout, showing a voice transmission that saved an armored column. The source, a call identifier belonging to Station H42, marked as destroyed on December 9. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped further. March 7, 1945, Remagen. A last-minute signal had reached his unit just before they found the charges under the railcar. The log listed the origin as Operator J.T. Lindley. Elwood's breath caught. Lindley had been declared missing weeks before the signal was recorded. Every time the voice had appeared, every time it had made the impossible possible, it had come from someone who wasn't supposed to be alive, or from somewhere that no longer existed. He stared at the documents. The ink was faded, but the implication burned clear. The transmissions were real, not tricks, not imagined, real, yet impossible. And every official report he cross-referenced had one thing in common: redactions. Entire paragraphs blacked out. Sections labeled "not for release." Signatures missing. The deeper he looked, the more the pages seemed to pull away from him, like the truth was always one layer below, always just beyond reach. He asked Ames for help locating Lindley's full service file. The response came back a day later: record missing, presumed destroyed in fire. That night, Elwood sat alone in his apartment, radio on the table in front of him. It still didn't work, still only gave static. He poured a small glass of brandy and stared at the blank ceiling. Had the voice been real? Every instinct in him said yes. But if it was, who had spoken? A ghost? A survivor who vanished from every record? A rogue operator who knew things no one else did? Or something else entirely? He didn't know. Maybe he never would. All he had were memories. The voice, the warnings, the lives saved, and the silence that always followed. Some part of him wanted closure, a name, a face, a final explanation. But another part, perhaps the wiser part, understood something deeper. Maybe it wasn't meant to be solved. Maybe the voice wasn't about who, it was about when, about being there in the moment, when everything hung in the balance, a guide in the fog, a signal in the dark. He touched the radio gently, then smiled, just a little. "Wherever you are," he whispered, "thank you." And in the quiet hum of the room, the static carried on. Years passed after the war, yet the story of the mysterious voice never truly left those who had lived it. Each year a handful of the original men from Lieutenant Marcus Elwood's unit met quietly in a small, out-of-the-way diner in the Midwest. They had scattered across the country. Some had families, others had settled into peaceful lives, but every year without fail they gathered to share memories and to remember the days when the world seemed caught between silence and chaos. No one ever spoke openly about the voice, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt sacred, like a shared secret none could fully explain. They joked about ghosts and guardian angels. Some called it a trick of the radio waves, others a miracle, but no one claimed to know the source. One evening, as the group sat around a worn wooden table, George Patterson, the soft-spoken radio operator who had been with them in the Ardennes, looked thoughtful. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup as he spoke. "You know," he began slowly, "I heard something once, long before the war." He paused, glancing around the room. "Back when I was a kid, living in a small town up in Michigan, I used to tinker with an old radio my dad gave me. One night, I picked up a voice on a frequency no one should have been using." The room grew quiet. It was the same voice, calm, precise, just like it was in the war. Elwood leaned in. "Before the war?" Patterson nodded. "Yeah, I thought it was a prank at first, but I never forgot it." The group exchanged glances. The idea was strange. How could the voice exist before the war? What was it trying to say? Was it always there, just waiting for those who needed it? Later that night, as the veterans parted ways, Elwood sat alone on the porch of his home. He pulled out the old radio again, its weight familiar in his hands. He turned the dial slowly, listening for anything. Static filled the room. But then, in the crackling white noise, a faint whisper seemed to call out almost like a distant memory. Years later still, in the early 1950s, Elwood found himself in a quiet conversation with a radio technician named Harold Myers. They had met through mutual veterans networks, bonding over old equipment, and shared stories. One afternoon, as they repaired an aging radio set, Myers casually mentioned something unusual. "There was a similar transmission during the Korean War," Myers said, not looking up. "Different tone, but the same kind of strange signal. It showed up on a few civilian frequencies, then disappeared whenever anyone tried to pinpoint it." Elwood's heart quickened. "Did anyone ever find out where it came from?" Myers shrugged. "No one could lock down the source. It was like chasing a shadow." The idea that the mysterious voice had appeared again years later and in a different conflict unsettled Elwood. Was it a coincidence, or something more? Sitting by the window that evening, Elwood thought about the voice. The countless times it had steered them clear of danger, warned them of traps, and led them home through impossible odds. No matter how many years passed, no official record named the operator. No face was ever found. The signal's logs hinted at lost stations and missing men, but answers always dissolved into silence. He wondered if it even mattered. Maybe, he thought, the voice wasn't tied to a single person. Maybe it wasn't a man at all. Maybe it was something else. A warning carried on the airwaves, waiting for the right moment, the right people to hear it. A signal from beyond the chaos, guiding those caught in the storm. Elwood smiled softly to himself, touched the radio one last time and whispered, "Thank you." And somewhere, far away, the static whispered back, "If you're a proud American who honors the courage of your war heroes, hit that subscribe button and join us for more powerful stories of bravery and sacrifice."